grant that the Nuffield Foundation in London is funding on studying how to improve well-being at work. And there are specific instances in this presentation where I'm going to point out where we need to improve well-being at work. Because ultimately, work is good because it gives us a good income and a standard of living, but it should also make us happy and proud of what we are doing, not just say, oh, well, you know, this is a big ball, but I need the money, kind of thing. Now, how did we get to where we are today? Well, the main, possibly biggest transformation that humanity ever experienced was the Green Revolution. Technological revolution in agriculture, in growing food, had moved. And it's the 19th century really that brought most of the changes. Now, many people, historians, economists and all that, talked about industrialization and the impact it had. What I'm more interested in currently in these transformations is that industrialization also brought social change. And it's the combination of the economic and social change that we have to get right, that I don't think we haven't got yet. What I'm going to do in the remaining of this presentation is to talk about the path that the industrial world is likely to take in light of modern technologies, and then draw lessons from there, how to improve well-being, how to improve this beneficial combination of economic and social progress, and what role especially government have to play, because as Pierre Riviere mentioned in the introduction, my interest and always I thought my motivation to understanding the way that the economic world works, and especially labor markets, is to advise government, or at least writing academic papers on what government should be doing, and then eventually they take it up. As Keynes said, don't expect governments to listen to you immediately, and I do have bitter experience from that in my own countries of origin, but eventually every politician is a slave of some defunct economist, as he famously pointed out in his introduction. But here I have another famous quotation, which is much lesser known, by Paul Samuelson, arguably the father of modern economics. In 1970, he said, progress comes from technical invention, that's what we call innovation today, and we shall be ever grateful to the discoverer of fire, the inventor of the electric dynamo, and the perfecter of all London saws. Well, I thought I agreed with Paul Samuelson on everything, but I'm afraid I do have to disagree there. I don't think Hollander sauce is such an important invention. The less we have with it, the better, as far as I'm concerned. But then he added on, but there are also momentous social inventions, and indeed as society becomes more affluent, these may become increasingly vital. Well, I could have taken that as my motivation for shifting to study more social well-being, but in fact, this quotation was pointed out to me by one of my PhD students after I said that I was going to study well-being in the future of work. So let's begin with automation and good work. So the question is, how can we use innovation in a way that gives us sustainable and inclusive growth? Well, there are panels later on that discuss this. Now I'm going to make some more general remarks, I guess, here. We need growth that provides a good standard of living for all of society. And then the question is, has COVID-19 changed our perceptions or even the choices that we have? And I will focus on the labor market mainly. In parallel, the environment is a massive issue, but I'm not going to cover it here. In fact, I think the session that follows this one is about the environment, if I'm not mistaken. Note that when we talk today about these policies, we say ESG. The E stands for the environment, S stands for social, and that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the S of ESG. And in the end of my talk, I'm going to make remarks about what employers should be doing and government, and that's the G of the ESG. So I'm going to talk to you 2 out of 3. And the first one will be addressed by people that follow this presentation here. Now, innovation today is taking place at a much faster pace than in the past. It's also spreading faster. If you see the speed, for example, at which the smartphone expanded, I don't think we can live without a smartphone today. And the way that the AI has penetrated, the artificial intelligence is penetrating home and office. Was not so long ago, I mean, the smartphone is only, 15 years old? Not so long ago, in a presentation, someone was saying in amazement, he said, do you realize that in the UK, 97% of the people have access to a smartphone? And I guess he was expecting people to be surprised that so many have access, but then someone said, and what do the other 7% do? 93% have access to the smartphone. I mean, that's how we got used to it. Before the smartphone, the only new innovations that were spreading fast were medical innovations. I think the record that ranked number 1 was the stent. I think it took 7 years between the discovery of the stent and the wide application in medicine. But I think the smartphone has beaten that. Of course, because of the importance of these new discoveries that the World Economic Forum and others are calling it the fourth industrial revolution. Now, the implication for production is that we're automating many production processes. Robotics and artificial intelligence use sophisticated supply chains that are making sure that production is relying more and more on machinery, and it's organized in a way that not even management can understand very well. We heard the governor mention very wisely that we depend so much on supply chains, and even something like a lockdown in China, which is thousands of miles away, is influencing the way that we do economics here because of these complex supply chains. And because of all these changes that are not easily understood, they're so complex, workers are undergoing substantial changes in their well-being, and we are seeing, in fact, mental illness and stress at work increasing when we should be seeing it decreasing. So the key question is everyone engaged in production benefiting from these changes, or are some left behind? And the way I define good innovation is one that ensures that workers benefit from it through good work and not through government transfers. Modern technology has the capacity to remove stress and improve well-being, but it can also lead to bad outcomes, and it's up to us how we use it. In fact, I don't think there is. I think it's probably the biggest difference between modern technologies and those we had in the past. I think actually there is a later slide on that. Is that we do have a choice on how we use it now. So I don't believe that new technologies bringing the end of work, although there have been writings about that. There have even been books with titles saying it's the end of work. I think that's far, far from anything you might expect to see. What we are seeing, in fact, is huge transformations, not end of work, but transforming work. And To give you examples, in the very beginning, when computers penetrated the office, the biggest transformation was that jobs in the middle of the skills distribution were taken over by machinery. People with possibly university degrees but good education, data processors, administrators, and so on. Those were taken over, filers. When I first got my job at the London School of Economics, we had people actually concerned with filing papers, where obviously those things don't happen anymore. In fact, I'm stuck with those ancient papers in my office, and they keep telling me, you have to throw these things away, but now they're ancient monuments. I think I want to put them in a museum somewhere, except that no museum will ever take them. And what happened there was what's known as the polarization of employment, and the name most associated with that is David, author of MIT. You can see here an example of polarization in European countries, mainly, I guess, that was computed by my colleagues at the LSE, Alan Manning and co-authors, that in every country that you see here, the jobs that pay in the middle range of the wage distribution, the numbers employed there went down, whereas the numbers employed in the higher paying jobs and the lowest paying jobs went up. I should emphasize actually that this is on wage distribution, not on skills distribution. And it's only if there is close correspondence between wages and skills that you would also find it in the skills distribution, which in labor markets with frictions and imperfections, you don't have a perfect correlation. But when you look at wages, that's what you get. It's also quite interesting here to see which countries are the most successful ones, Ireland and Sweden being in creating higher paying jobs, so people shifting to the top end rather than dropping down to the bottom end, in contrast to a country like Italy, which hasn't been very successful with modern technologies. Now, following that, robotics became more and more common, especially in manufacturing. Manufacturing employs about 90% of robots. Of course, the big technological innovation in robots that increase their use so much is free movement, to become self-motored machines. Robots have been around for a very long time. The term was invented in the 1920s. And in the 1940s, we already had automated assembly lines in car manufacture. But the problem with those robots is that they were fixed on the floor and they could only move arms. So they were good for assembly lines, but not for much else. In the 90s, when the robot that could move without assistance by itself, you get a completely steep rise in the number of robots being employed in manufacturing. Now, this has led to productivity growth, but it's questionable whether it's actually replaced jobs. I think there is some evidence that it's replacing low-skilled jobs, manual jobs. For example, a company that does a lot of online retail deliveries, you see how I'm avoiding to advertise any brand name, is now employing almost exclusively robots in their warehouse. And robots don't look like Frankenstein and that kind of thing anymore. They're just platforms that move around and carry boxes in warehouses, most of them in application now. So that increases productivity. It takes over some manual jobs, but not much more than that. And in fact, what we see, and this is really the sort of more formal proof of what I'm saying, was by Guy Michaels and George Greitz, again at the LSE, Guy Michaels, when they looked at the impact of robots on manufacturing sectors. And you also see it here actually in a way. I mean, this is obviously not a proof, but you can see the blue line, the pink lines. You do see colors here. The pink lines show you how many robots there are in manufacturing in these countries for 1,000 employees. So like the UK has something like 10 robots for 1,000 employees. I think those are thousands actually, I would think. Yeah, because I'm, no, let me see. No, sorry, no, they're not thousands, they're numbers. Germany and Japan are the ones who employ most robots in production. And you can see that the countries that employ most robots in production are also the ones that lost jobs in manufacturing less than the others, mainly by exploiting their international comparative advantage. You know, like the UK car industry, for example, has been decimated completely because of competition from Germany. And it was a cautious decision to switch to services, especially financial services, and that's why you have that huge fall in manufacturing, rather than automating manufacturing itself. Finally, in this development of automation comes artificial intelligence, which is much more recent, but also with more far-reaching implications. For AI to work, we need big data, and we need trained workers to program the machines. And that's really where we need to focus on the transformation nowadays, is to improve data availability more widely, and to train more workers in STEM subjects, which I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on. Science, technology, engineering, mathematics. Now with AI, I mean, some people are worried in that they think that we're going to lose control. There's no reason why we should lose control. It's true that once you allow the Internet of Things and communication between machines, it may not be easy to see where production is going, but it doesn't have to be like that. And again, once again, we do have a choice on how to manage these things. The implication for companies is that, as I was saying, that you do have a choice. You see, sometimes people say, we're now observing the biggest technological transformation ever. I don't believe it, actually. In fact, I think electricity is a much bigger transformation than technology. And when people look at me in astonishment, I say to them, okay, choose, would you rather live without electricity, or would you rather live without your laptop and your smartphone and all that? And there is no question on what the answer to that would be. The difference there was that when electricity came along as a source of power, there was no question about what companies had to do. Just replace steam power or whatever or muscle power or whatever you were doing before with electrical power. But when AI is coming along, then it's questionable. Is that what we want to do? Do we want to leave the initiative to machines communicating between themselves, or do we still want to have human control and using the machines to get rid of the tedious jobs? And I think it should be the latter. So the challenge that we're facing now is not that we're going to fail to create jobs. We will create jobs if we want them. The challenge is the transition of the workers to the new jobs and not the end of employment. And especially the challenge is how to create good jobs where people get satisfaction from work as well as an income. Employment and unemployment rates in advanced countries have remained virtually flat, except for short-term fluctuations associated with the business cycle. Admittedly, some countries are at a higher level than others, and that was the focus of my earlier work. But there have never been trend rises or trend falls in unemployment over long periods of time. Now, there are negatives, of course, and we haven't been very careful so far in how we have been applying these new technologies. For example, I consider it a failure that most gains from new work now went to top incomes, and inequality is rising. That's especially striking in the United States, in that since the financial crisis of 2008, the gains from all economic growth in the United States went to the top 10% of incomes. The rest was stagnation, and therefore you get this pulling apart of high and low incomes. Another failure that I consider is that the big digital companies are penetrating both economic and social life through social media. There are known consequences for our lives. We've lost our privacy. The use of data is made to manipulate attitudes. The whole Trump campaign against the election, for example, the last US election, would it have taken place had there been no social media? I doubt it. Cambridge Analytics, we know they tried to influence the Brexit referendum in Britain, and they did influence it. These developments are not good. The European Union is doing a very good job with privacy, with the GDPR, but it's only a first step, and it's mainly because we don't know where the second step is going to come from. And maybe it's not a coincidence that when you look at happiness surveys, which I think actually economists should pay even more attention than they're beginning to pay, respondents usually give work and related activities as the ones that give them least satisfaction, which shouldn't really be like that. One of the worst things, they ask people to say how happy they felt at intervals during the day, obviously previous day. And one of the time intervals that gives them least satisfaction from life is when the boss wants to see them at work. You should be happy to see your boss because he or she influences what you are doing at work. So you should say, oh yeah, this is my opportunity. And yet, it's something that you want to avoid and go to the pub with your friends instead, which is one that gives you most satisfaction actually to most people, going for drinks after work. So what is good work? Well, it's one that gives dignity, autonomy, and equality of pay, autonomy within the limits that the company has set for you, but you should be having some autonomy. You should be able to be making decisions. Human beings want to make decisions. And it should give you dignity. You should be proud of what you're doing, not say, oh, I'm doing the job because it pays well. It's one that enables people to develop their talents and gives them a sense of community, because we are social animals, as Aristotle famously said. Actually, he said we are also political animals, which I don't approve as much as the social animal. And research that we did at the institute that is funded by this project that I mentioned before is we found that good work gives better health outcomes, and we are researching that further to make sure that there are causations, better mental health, and in the pandemic areas in Britain, this is UK data, areas that have higher standards of good work perform much better in terms of hospitalizations and deaths, because as we know, the virus interacts with other diseases that you might have, including mental diseases. So what about COVID? Has it changed things very much? Well, this is a new concern. Before COVID, new technology was introduced at a manageable pace. COVID introduces another feature of jobs, actually, something that as economists in the past we never paid attention to. I said that human beings are social animals. We never thought of socializing as having a cost other than any arguments that we might have. But in fact, what COVID does is that proximity to other human beings is a costly venture. And therefore work started being organized, and technology started being geared to discovering ways of working with as little proximity to other human beings as possible. And the reason that COVID attracted more research from economists, in fact other scientists as well, than any other event in the past. Economic research, you could arguably say, it started with Adam Smith in 1776. And of course, the interests of economists and their research topics have been changing over the last 250 years, but they have never changed so rapidly and so drastically as with COVID. Within the first year of the appearance of the virus, CPR in London published something like 1,000 papers on COVID by economists, which is ridiculous how much human capital went into it. And it's precisely because of that, you give economists another feature of work and even consumption. Avoid getting close to other human beings, and papers just pour out. Now, for our purposes, there are two important consequences of this proximity problem. The first one is that automation accelerates, because automation doesn't involve human beings coming into proximity with each other. And the second is that social sectors are badly hit because they rely on human interaction. Now, what I call social sectors is the hospitality industry, travel, conferencing, sitting next to each other. And those were the sectors that were going to create most jobs before the pandemic, because those are the things that robots don't do very well. You know, if you want to go to, if you want someone to offer hospitality to you, you don't want it to be offered by a robot. Or if you need some health care, mental care, you don't want to do it with a robot. Well, those activities now are becoming costly. So the result of that, if you look at it in the abstract, is that job destruction side of the new technologies accelerates, but in the job creation side decelerates. And therefore, the loss of jobs increases with a threat of unemployment, but definitely with a challenge of more transition. But then the other jobs that were going to attract them are not created at that pace. And even if employers try to create them, the workers are not willing to move into those jobs, which is precisely what we see now in the travel and hospitality sector, that they're very, very short of workers. And people ask me, how could we be coming out of a pandemic, out of a recession? And yet there are companies like the airline companies, hotels, restaurants cannot find workers. Well, because workers are still worried about proximity to other human beings. And that's why you see that shortage. The implications of that is that because of the acceleration of automation, we might be seeing more inequality, and we're seeing more independent work, what's called gig work, which is not good work. Company CEOs say that post-COVID, they expect automation to accelerate further, and that includes e-commerce, now food services, and not just manufacturing. In e-commerce, you see it already. Much of retail has moved on online platforms. In food services, I was wondering what it was, but recently I was invited to give a keynote, in fact, on new technologies in food services by an international conference that takes place annually in Shanghai, except that now it was online. And when you read up, in fact, what's happening in food services, many restaurant owners like the idea of what's known as dark kitchen, where kitchens are not in public places, open where people can see them. They are outside city centers remotely. Then you have specialized delivery companies. They cook the food. The delivery company prepare food, takes it to your home, and you consume restaurant food at about the same speed that you would get if you went to a restaurant and sat at a table. And that's what's generating a lot of excitement in the food industry nowadays, that people socializing more at home so that they avoid coming out, mixing with other people. And the employers like it because it's a lot cheaper for them. It's very difficult to run a good restaurant with an open kitchen and open area for people to sit. Now, the other second implication is that companies devise ways of working to reduce social contract. More generally, remote work, remote working from home is becoming more and more widespread. You have online consultations. In the medical sector, in London, we cannot see our doctors. We still have to do everything on the phone or on FaceTime. There is less business travel, more virtual meetings, and we have webinars instead of seminars. New term that came into the dictionaries. Are these temporary or are they going to last long? I think many of these will persist in the future. We're going to create a new normal. Automation will obviously not be reversed. And as a result of what I said, job destruction from automation and the transitions that we need to avoid unemployment rise by about 5 to 10%. Before COVID, the figure given was about 15%. Now you should expect more like 20% over the next 10 years. And job creation in social sectors will rise less fast. Business, travel services will, and customer relations in retailing, of course, will increase, but not at the speed that we were expecting before. Companies are inventing new ways of working remotely. Zoom software will develop further. It will not disappear. There is a lot of employee monitoring, that software that is being developed, surveillance. China, of course, is champion in developing surveillance software and using it effectively. We have improved e-commerce platforms. You know, I don't know if it's the same in other cities, but in London, you can order anything you want in the morning and you get it delivered to your home in the afternoon by the leader in e-commerce, the leading e-commerce platform. And there are improved business meetings in e-rooms now. Now you might say, you know, what made economists and businesses do that? Well, there are also a theory in economics that in the abstract it could explain all these things, but and COVID really gave you the chance to test it. One of them is directed technical change, that you look to invent technologies that are addressing a particular problem that you have in the time. And once they're introduced, they continue in use. So a single event that might last 3 years, like COVID, gives you a technological change that will last forever practically. You know, the path of the economy after that is different than what it was before because of that one event. In the past, only wars had that impact. You know, the Second World War has changed technologies. You know, look at flying, for example. And it's also in the general sense what you might call a nudge theory, that you don't do something unless you are forced to, and then you realize it was a good thing after all. This goes against the maximizing economist, and working from home is like that. Like if you went 5 years ago and you said to your employer, "Can I work from home 1 day a week?" The employer would have looked at you in a strange way and say, "Well, you're obviously not motivated for this work." Well, now the employer tells you, "Can you work from home 1 day a week?" Because you avoid commuting costs and so on and so forth. Commuting, by the way, is the thing that people hate most about work. No, seeing the boss is the thing they hate most. The second most hated thing is commuting. So the more we manage to use technology to reduce the commuting costs, the more life satisfaction will be. Now, there are things that I'm not going to address, but I just point them out, that the big picture is that there should be a decline in the clear distinction between commercial space and residential space because people work from home. And we're seeing it already in the UK. Rents in rural and coastal areas have risen a lot relative to urban rents and house prices. If we transfer 20% of work from commercial areas to residential areas, which is what people like the McKinsey Global Institute are predicting based on the surveys of thousands and thousands of surveys of their managers, that should change the structure of the city. You know, like I live 5 miles from the center of London, and I work in the center of London. If I walk from my office in any direction, it's guaranteed that within 5 minutes I'm going to find a Starbucks coffee place where people having breaks from work. If I do that at home, all I'm going to find 5 minutes away is more houses or maybe some open park space. Well, that obviously needs to change if we are going to have business-like activities at home. The consequences for jobs is that inequality is moving fast. As I was saying, digital entrepreneurs are becoming mega rich, and they're finding new ways of spending their money, like flying to the moon on their own, or buying Twitter or whatever else they might want to do. Many of the jobs that companies create are not good career jobs. There aren't that many warehouse jobs, but gig employment is expanding, and those jobs have no sick leave, no pensions, no paid vacation leave, no protection from market fluctuations. It shouldn't really be allowed. The government should interfere there. So they're making the transition. Another 5 to 10 minutes max. Okay. Now let me tell you one thing. When we talk about modern technologies now, we immediately think of these glamorous companies, Apple, Google, Tesla, you know, these. And they expanded hugely in the last 2 to 3 decades. And it's everyone's ambition to go and work for that. You know, like no company gets more applications per vacancy, at least until recently, than Apple. When Apple advertises jobs, hundreds of applications. Some other equivalent company somewhere else advertises for jobs, they don't get any. And So I mean, that's where all the glamour is, for, especially for young people. But although they do create jobs for highly qualified people, and they do give you the chance of moving out and becoming rich, they are not the companies that are going to create jobs for the masses of people. They are not creating enough jobs, in fact. What you see there is that they create jobs themselves, they become big, but then many of the competitors who didn't manage to keep up lose so many jobs that the sector as a whole has fewer jobs at the end than before. You know, take book selling. There used to be lots of booksellers in high streets and adjacent to universities and colleges, employing many people. Then something like Amazon comes along selling books, and they employ lots of people. That's how they started this book selling company. And although they have grown and they're employing a lot of people in this business, all the other booksellers in the high streets have closed down. The only place where you find booksellers now is in airports, you know, in case you are bored when you get into the airport and you go and buy a book to read on the flight. The sector of book selling is employing lots and lots of fewer people than before. And that's a feature everywhere. You have these champion companies that expand, but then they force everyone else to close down. So where are the people going to get the jobs? Well, they're going to get the jobs in the sectors that involve social interaction, where we don't like machinery to be involved. These are mainly jobs that social care, specialized health care, hospitality as well. They're entirely in the service sector. Now you might say, how could I say 5 minutes ago that social care jobs are not being created, or people don't want them because of COVID? Well, that's because of COVID. Sooner or later, they're going to get used to it. If you look 10 years from now, we're going to be even more of a service economies, serving other people. There won't be jobs being done in isolation. Even if you do it remotely, you will be serving other people, you know, like our doctors who that we call when we have a problem, and that's still something. I would call that a social interaction, except that it's done remotely to avoid coming into direct contact. So we are service societies. You might say, okay, fair enough, that might be okay for North America and Europe. What about Africa? I'm afraid Africa is having a tough. It will have a tough time because it doesn't have the path to economic development that China had 40 years ago through low-cost manufacturing, because manufacturing is getting automated. They have to move directly into services, but how they do it, I don't know. I mean, some European countries succeeded it. You know, Southern Europe, for example, many of the countries grew without having to go through manufacturing, but it's not easy, it's tough. Education, where robotics and AI require new types of skill, and as I was saying, we do need more STEM training. Universities, of course, need to adapt their curriculum to that, but there's my old friend James Heckman points out many times, is that if you are going to make boys and girls love STEM, then you better make sure you start at age 1 or 2, telling them about numbers and what wonderful games you can play with numbers. And as soon as they go to nursery, make sure that they have mathematically literate teachers, and to talk to them about science as well. And that's the way that you get people into STEM. It's not something that can happen instantly by saying at age 15, okay, it's now time to learn science. Formal education is not enough because technology is changing so rapidly, and we do need training in work and lifelong learning as well. And the best kind of training is the one that is done at the company level, because companies know better what's required. But then there is poaching, and there are small companies that can't afford it, and that's where government needs to help. I do think that government should treat company the same way as they're treating formal education in school, and And as they are treating unemployed people for social assistance, for example, that they should simply fund training in the way they fund education. I mean, after all, who decides how the teaching will be done, and especially some parts of the teaching and how boys and girls should be treated in school? It's the school authorities themselves. And so there's no reason why government shouldn't trust employers to be doing the same about their employees. I mean, obviously there should be monitoring, and they should give them instruction, directives on what type of training they should be doing. But until they treat training the same way, it's not going to become respectable and effective. Germany is the only country that has come close to doing that through the apprentice system. But it's been tried by many other countries and they failed completely. The UK is a dismal failure, for example, in doing that kind of thing. But in addition, we need the social skills, because that's where the jobs are going to come from. In the hospitality industry, caring for children and old people, for the sick. All these need to be taught at school, but they're still not taught at all. You know, they sort of tell them vague things, but some kind of basic social psychology, some basic medicine, how to serve other people, how to talk to other people, show respect towards the other person. There is more writing and talk about that in ancient Greek writings than what you see today in school writings, actually. And whether we like it or not, we're going to get bigger government. The 80s was the decade of small governments. I think the first 3 decades of the 21st century are the decades of big government. Because of what I just said about education and training, public health is becoming a big issue, and that's a social good. Government needs to take the initiative on that. And property rights that arise from R&D need to be protected. And it's not very easy to protect intellectual property rights these days. I mean, we hear big thefts of intellectual ideas. That I would definitely not mention names. And those need to be protected. But we do need government because of the data privacy issues, the fraudulent abuse of technologies. These big mega companies that are located everywhere in governments find it very difficult to control. You know, what's Facebook doing, what's Google doing with our data, we don't know. Government needs to do its own R&D and make sure that they have ways of giving us confidence that our data will not be abused. Jobs are moving away from organized labor. Unions have declined completely. They are not suited to the present work environment. Government needs to step in and play the role that unions played in the beginnings of industrialization and big manufacturing companies, providing services for the gig economy. And of course, there is inequality that needs to be addressed, because the S in the ESG will not do very well if we allow inequalities to grow and grow. Social spending is needed, of course, to support unemployment. For that, I have to refer you to my earlier writings. There's no time to go through it, but let's not forget that we do need social support as well in making the transitions. And what about COVID? Well, with COVID is right now, most of the effort is what the governor earlier talked about, on how to find the COVID-induced recession and the other shocks that came along. But what I talked about now is something that needs to be done over the next 10 years. And at the same time, move faster because of the way that COVID has made technologies to move faster. And it's a tough job. I mean, governments are facing a very tough job now, tougher than before. I saw the comment that now the situation is not like it was in the 1970s. I actually think it's worse than it was in the 1970s, actually, what we need to do. I don't know if that's what Christine Lagarde had in mind when she said that, but maybe you know better about that. So that's it. That's what I want to say, that the new technologies can increase productivity, they can increase our well-being if they are correctly used, but there are risks, and government and companies have a role to play in mitigating those risks and making sure that we get improvement in our standard of living and not deterioration. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, Chris, this was certainly a tour de force, amazing overview of a lot of the issues that we're facing when we're thinking about employment and the future of employment. I know we are a bit behind schedule, but we also started behind schedule, so I don't want to cut the discussion. So I would like to open the floor for questions. Please raise your hand, and I'll try to get a few, and then we'll do a first round, and then maybe turn it back to Chris. So please go ahead. And already, if you raise your hand, we can, yes, and we'll go next, please.
So thank you very much, Professor Pissarides, for this great keynote. I'm Najat Al-Mikawi from Paris Dauphine University and Central Bank, Moroccan Central Bank, Bank al-Maghrib. So as you said, and we have many research dealing with this topic about technical changes and innovation, and we have many research showing that this innovation change lead more productivity with, as you said, qualified and innovative people. I am wondering, with this new trend of working remotely, as we have seen during these last months, and we will see again many companies, but also, I guess, research department working in this, still in this way. I am wondering, because with limited interaction, with no research field, no working field, this could affect significantly the trend of innovation, because we have many research showing that most of the biggest innovation comes through interaction with people and with and having also this working with people and working in the real world, not working through our camera, our screen. Thank you.
Let's take a few more and then turn back to you. So please.
Okay, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. My name is Abdel Samad Saidi. I'm from the Central Bank of Morocco, and as you know, the digital transformation changes our way of living, our way of producing and consuming. And in emerging and developing countries, we start to observe a lot of changes, remote work, electronic administration. However, we think that there is other priority, as you mentioned in the presentation. Education is maybe should be the first priority to avoid a numerical divide and to succeed this digital transformation. What do you think, Professor? Thank you.
Thanks. Let's turn here to the question.
Yes, thank you. You've mentioned actually one of the aspects that today is noticed in both developing and developed countries, which is the pace at which the gig economy is growing. And right now it's exposing a lot of gig workers to unsafety because they are not protected, they don't have insurance, they don't have social protection, and they don't have proper planning for the future, aka their retirement. And this is something that we notice both in the developing and the developed world. But in emerging markets, we have much less policy margins. So what can we do? What can be done actually on a global level, and how can that be more tweaked for developing markets? As I said, given the small policy margins that they have.
So Chris, before turning back to you, I will use my privilege as moderator to also ask you a couple of questions. So first, I thought there was a tension in the presentation, you started by telling us good innovation is innovation that benefits all the workers and does not require transfers to, quote unquote, compensate the losers. But you ended with a long list of interventions that governments need to do in order to achieve a more inclusive growth given the type of innovation we have. So does it mean that the innovation we have is not good? Or more broadly, if we think about either globalization or if we think about the process of Schumpeterian creation destruction, is it even possible to think about the type of good innovation you have in mind that would benefit everyone without some sort of social intervention? The second point I wanted, there was something very interesting, I think, in your remarks about the future of the skill premium. In a sense, it seems to me you're describing a world where the skill premium could decrease a lot because the returns to education could be much lower in the future, given that there's a lot of substitution from whether algorithms or AI or capital for the type of works. It's not just the physical work that is being replaced. It's also some of the white collar jobs. And so if this is the world we live in, we can think of two versions of this world. One is one in which each of us is a robot, and the robot gets up in the morning and goes and does the tasks that we used to do and generate income and produces value added, and we're free to write poetry or engage in activities that give us a good life and good work and a good balance. Another version of this world is Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk owns all the robots. In terms of GDP, these two worlds are equivalent. In terms of well-being, they were vastly, vastly different. So do you have views on this? I'll turn it back to you with this.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the very, very interesting questions. The question of innovation, whether we need interaction for innovation, the answer is yes. Yes, actually we do. I didn't have it. And we don't just need interaction between people, we need interaction between universities and companies. Most of the good innovations came along when a company would involve a university department, and then it would grow from there through startups and have the spillover into startups. And with government making sure that bankruptcy laws are not offensive to those who don't succeed. Something like the model of Silicon Valley is still very much alive. So you're right that if we moved everything remotely, then we wouldn't get as much innovation. But the remote work that is moving now is not in the R&D section, except for if people want to work out their own new theories in isolation, which we do all the time, of course. You do need, in fact, I was working 1 day a week at home ever since I first got my job, my job in academia, because you need to collect all those things and ideas that you heard before and focus and sit down and write them and think and change them many times. So although you're right in principle of what you said, absolutely right, I don't see that as a risk because of the increase in remote work now. But countries do need to involve more collaboration between universities and companies. The United States is succeeding. Germany and Sweden in Europe are succeeding. Not Britain, for example, and definitely not Spain, Italy. And as a result, their innovation environment, as it's sometimes called, is very, very weak. The question on education, yes, we do need absolute education, and we need education directed in that sense. You see, young people are they are influenced a lot about the type of education they're taught and about the things they should focus on and what's right in essence to do in a society, and that's up to those who choose the curricula and organize the thing. But I don't see any other solution other than train them through education to avoid the inequalities and the poor outcomes that might have there. Which was the third one? It was, yeah, it was. Actually, I mean, you're saying that it's developing countries that have a limited options, but in fact, advanced countries have it as well because the gig jobs don't have a base. You know, they might work for different companies. They might, you know, it's not like having a factory where you go in and you're always there, or you all have a similar contract and you do it. So it's a struggle, but you have to do it. You know, like my view of that actually is that governments, through the relevant department, that might be the Social Security Department, should take a more active role in the management of pensions, of sick leave, of vacation leave, of gig workers. You know, like the typical case now is that although there might be a state pension, there is a state pension, in fact, generally, that there might be on top of that company pensions. If you want to go on leave, you have to negotiate with your own employer how long your leave should be. If you are sick, most likely in the gig economy, you don't get paid, you just don't work. Where you should register with the relevant government department and do those things through the government, which then collects money from the employers of the gig workers. So it becomes like a kind of nanny state, as they say. But whenever I say that, I mean people always tell me, oh, you know, you are utopian or idealist. You know, how could you trust government to do these things? You know, they're going to get the money and go and spend it somewhere else or add it onto the general budget, which is a risk. But in many countries, they manage health like that, so there's no reason, I mean, not always very well, there is no reason why they shouldn't manage other social activities, including holiday pay. You know, I'm a gig worker, but I contribute to a government fund, my employer contributes to a government fund, and I'm entitled to 4 weeks a year holiday, a paid holiday, which I get, which the government pays me. I think it's feasible. It needs changes in organization, but we're changing organizations all the time. And finally, I think you have a question. I remember the second one, so let me answer it first. Yeah, that's always a problem. You do need social support in the transitions, but it should be transitional support. Now, in the case of unemployment, we know the answer because I spent about 30 years studying it, and it is that government should tie the support to retraining programs, provided they set up good training programs in companies the way I said before, they subsidize it. So they help workers in the beginning, you know, say for 6 months, you leave the worker alone to see if they can do some self-selectioning where they get matched according to the talents that they know best, at least most of the time. If that doesn't succeed, then you start putting them through training programs, and you give them support in the meantime, but it shouldn't be long-term support, otherwise it will create the disincentives. The government money should be spent more in what I just said here, in encouraging new innovation, in regulating data use, conditions at work, that kind of thing. What did it remind me of your first point?
I was asking about the skill premium in the longer term.
Oh, yeah, the skill premium, actually, it's interesting. I mean, the thing is that very, very high skills are becoming even more valuable, though, because those are not replaced by machines. So the top 1% will benefit even more than before. Below, there might still be a skill premium gap, rising, because the skill premium depends on the relative attractiveness or performance of skills. So low skills will suffer even more because of robotics and because we now know how to replace manual work. you know, like in agriculture, I mentioned that food commission I went to. I mean, agriculture employs about 2 or 3% of the labor force in countries like US, UK, Germany. It could go down to nearly zero, because now robots are taking over. Robots and drones are taking over completely in agriculture, or at least beginning to. You know, a drone goes over vast areas of land, identifies dry areas, and immediately generates a water system. It identifies where fruit is ripe and sends robots to collect that fruit. So the agricultural workers are having a hard time. But then the manager, who is the highly skilled person who makes sure that they work well and they don't go and burn all the produce or something, his job is becoming even more valuable. So it will go up. So the skill premium within agriculture should increase because of that automation.
So I think there were a few more questions. Do we have time to take a few more questions, or should we? Yeah, 5 minutes. Okay, so Antonio over here, and then the gentleman, and then Jihad, and the lady over there. So I think I will cap it at 4, because otherwise we won't have time. So Antonio. The mic seems to be going in the wrong direction. We won't hear you if you don't have the mic.
Or not going anywhere, in fact.
There.
Thank you very much, Professor. I just have one question. You predicted or called for bigger governments, but you didn't address the problem of financing. How will we finance this bigger intervention of the government, especially in a world where the debt of the public debt has ballooned since 2008, and especially since the COVID-19, due to the monetary policy that injected heavily liquidity into the economy? How would you finance this big government? Thank you.
Please pass it along to, okay, Antonio, go ahead.
You mentioned that content-intensive sectors have a problem in finding workers. Why do we have upward wage rigidity? Why does society find it improper to pay more for content-intensive person? If a waiter needs to pay twice as much, why don't we pay twice as much? Why do we complain about shortages instead of paying them more?
Thank you. The gentleman in the row right before, please go ahead.
Thank you. Excuse me to ask you French. Si vous permettez, Hicham Atosh, je suis de l'Université Mohamed V de Rabat. Vous avez parlé un peu de l'innovation et sa relation avec la création de l'emploi qualifié. Les pays ne sont pas sur le même pied d'égalité technologique, et donc il y a un gap technologique. Et dans la plupart des pays, dont le Maroc, l'essentiel de l'emploi se fait dans l'informel. Et donc, quel lien peut-on faire entre l'emploi informel et les emplois de, je dirais, de proximité avec ce niveau-là de technologie et d'innovation? Merci.
Sorry, Chris will answer this set of 3 questions, then we'll have 2 more, and then we'll stop. Please go ahead, Chris.
I have actually, in the first, I mean, there were excellent questions, but the first 2 I have I have answers from practical people. The one on how do you fund it, you see, my view on how you fund is not one that is very popular with politicians. I'll tell you what it is. I think it should all be tax financed for sure. And you first decide what programs you are going to support in terms of training, controlling, surveillance of the big companies, the support of gig economy, and then you tax, and health especially, and then you tax the high incomes to pay for those programs. Now, I mentioned that a few times, and it's one that we had a long discussion about this kind of funding program at Lindau, which is the biggest gathering of economics Nobel laureates, and it seemed to agree with everyone except for the very right-wing economists who were present. But very recently, I was a British politician asked me, you know, how would you fund it? More or less your question, I think it was from somewhere up the top. And I said that, and he said to me, it makes a lot of sense, but if I do it, I'm going to lose the next election. So it's not popular. But then you might ask, why isn't it popular? You know, like, if you look at, as I mentioned, if you look at what happened since the financial crisis, low incomes have stagnated completely. High incomes went up like that. What's wrong with taking this portion for high incomes to support these down here through action, not by giving them money? You know, you don't take cash from these people and give cash to these people down here. You provide good quality services down here by taxing a portion of the gains. I think it's more of a social problem than economic, and unfortunately, it's a problem with democratic voting. You know, democratic voting is never consistent in this respect. You know, they want to see a very good health service, top health service, but they don't want to see the taxes that would finance that top health service. And I think simple things like dividing expenditure, for example, and identifying, you know, when you pay taxes, you don't just have the tax office come and telling you this is how much you owe. And then if you want to find out, in some countries, like in the UK, you can create an account, you can go into that account and you see how your money is spent. That's not, it's completely ineffective. You should have different tax bills. You say your tax to support a public health system is this much. Your tax to support pensions is this much. Go down so that you get some awareness of what's going on as a first step, which governments don't do. I think the Chinese government does it actually, because once I was taxed on some money I had in China, all those numbers, a long list of numbers, and it said education, health, social support, and all that. So that's one. Now the other one on with so much debt, how do you do it? I think I probably, I mean, was there? No, I'll come to you in a minute. No, I think you had a question. Did you,
on real wage not adjusting up in.
Oh yes. That. Okay. Yes. Sorry. No, I didn't have something. I also wondered about that actually, and in a recent meeting with some people in the service sector, employing a lot of people at the LSE that we had, I suggested it to them, and he basically, I mean, the guy he ran hotels and restaurants, and he said 90% of my costs are labor costs. If I increase even by 2 or 3% their wages across the board, I will either go bankrupt or will have to increase my prices and lose customers, and I won't be able to pay them. That's their argument. Now, of course, what I said to him is that, okay, you're not going to go bankrupt if you increase your prices, you're going to get fewer people for you, and that's life. You know, you need to pay your employees more. You lose some of the customers you have, but you have a more productive workforce. You know, I think Henry Ford was the first business leader who said that he paid his workers more because they could buy his cars by getting paid more. But that's their attitude. The attitude in the service sector is that because they are labor-intensive jobs, they're very, very concerned about increasing prices because they get a cost push on their final prices. I don't agree with it, but that's the reason. And finally, the one, do you remember what?
It was on the technological gap between the advanced economies and some of the...
Well, there, I mean, there is really nothing to say other than they should be creating the, I mean, governments in the developing world as well should be creating the environment for the new technologies that are coming along now, because of what I said earlier, that the low-cost manufacturing as a way to grow is not available, with minor exceptions. You're not going to grow by creating jobs for 40% of your labor force in manufacturing, which is what China did until recently. I think I might be proved disastrously wrong, but I think China was the last country to develop in this standard way that economic history books on, the Rostow stages of economic growth or something say. And unless they create the conditions for the new technologies, then they are going to be lagging behind. I mean, there is, of course, a good both theory and practice that if something can be done both by machinery and by human beings, and the human beings cost less because of wages, then you should employ the human beings. That's what they do. And my favorite comparison of that is between India and Japan. I'm sure there are lots and lots of Indian scientists. You see them in the United States, you see them in Europe, that they know about the new technologies, but India is employing much less the automation technologies than Japan. And Japan labor is much more expensive than in India, and that's the reason. But the thing about India, though, is that it does have the framework for introducing the new technologies when wages start rising, and it's going to do it. Where in Africa, where I don't think Morocco actually falls into this description of Africa, but in Africa, the problem you have is that they don't have the human capital and the infrastructure in place to adopt the technologies quickly when wages are rising. In fact, wages are not rising. Possible exception of South Africa in some cases, but if you look at countries like Nigeria, for example, they have so much wealth. They should direct that wealth to improving the infrastructure and their human capital.
So we have to be mindful of the time, and I've promised there would be 2 more questions. So Jihad first, and then there was a lady, I think it was you in the back. So we'll have these 2 questions, and I will cap it there. Please be brief, as give a chance to Chris to answer. Of course, we're all delighted to have a chance to pick his brain on these important issues. Jihad.
Let me ask you 3 follow-up questions very quickly. One on what Pierre-Olivier mentioned. We are competing with robots, or robots are competing with us. Some economists have proposed to start taxing robots. What do you think about this fiscal measure in order to align or to address this issue of heavy utilization of robots? The second follow-up question is related to the fact that COVID was an accelerator of trends, and technology-enabled activities is one of those that will change over time. And at the same time, you mentioned that the size and the role of the state is growing, where the utilization of technology is less or less advanced than we see in the private sector. How do you see the evolution of productivity in private sector and public sector in the next decade or so? And the third, also related follow-up question is on the issue of the recent fragmentation risks is calling, or there is a political discourse of relocating some of the activities back into closer to home, which means you need to have more labor, and usually more labor with low qualifications. With a high level of labor cost and social protections, how feasible this, I would say, idea of relocating manufacturing or changing the way manufacturing is done? Thank you.
Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Lina from Bank al-Maghrib. I'll try to be brief, actually. I was wondering if we are not still thinking of about the future of work with a kind of restrictive framework. I mean, the framework of an educational system that gives grades and that are associated with wages, with specific wages. while at the same time, actually, we are witnessing people, I mean, the people that gets the highest retribution are those that are thinking out of this box and that are taking risks. And also, on the other side, we have seen also with this crisis that some kind, I'm sorry, my voice is a bit hurting me, that's why. And we are also seeing that people that have maybe the most important jobs from a social perspectives are those that do not really have this dignity about your dignity. You were talking about how we define a good job, actually, and you talked about dignity, but we have seen, for example, people that are taking garbages or people that are working in the health system are not well remunerated within this framework. And also, at the same time, this incredible crisis shows, from my perspective, that what young people are looking for is also more freedom and maybe just enjoying working, enjoying the conditions in which they are working. So how can we, not philosophically, but as economists, think about this and integrate this into our vision of work? And in our models, I mean, how to integrate these things into our models. And something just funny is that when you think about the word labor, work in French, travail, it is coming from Latin, which means, and it was an instrument for torture. So I think that really we need to rethink about how we define work into our models and integrate maybe all these things that I've talked about. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris, final round. It's back to you.
The final round. Well, first of all, taxing robots, no, I'm against that, and I think it's completely infeasible because robots are very mobile. They're going to move away. You can only do that even if it makes, I mean, it might make sense economically, but you can only do it if the whole world were to collaborate in that. But I'm sure, you know, like if Western Europe, if the European Union started taxing robots, there would be some country somewhere which will say robots welcome, and they will all move there. I mean, I don't know if you followed it, but the most ridiculous example of this was that you know, the Boris Johnson government in Britain obviously doesn't like immigrants. Otherwise, he wouldn't have won the Brexit referendum. And now he's discovered Rwanda welcomes immigrants, and he plans to fly all the recent immigrants into the United Kingdom to Rwanda, which is ridiculous. You know, and there would be more countries following that. Your second follow-up was, remind.
It was about COVID and acceleration of the transformations.
Yeah, the acceleration of the transformation, we just have to cope with it. It makes it a lot more difficult. That's why I said it's now, the situation now I think is more difficult than in the 1970s, because COVID is introducing at the same time a big recession that needs macro measures, which are not easy given the debts that we accumulated, and at the same time accelerated automation, which I'm all in favor of, because I do believe that the service sector has a lot of jobs to create, and it will be created if they're given the incentive. Finally.
The last one was about fragmentation and the emergence of reshoring or nearshoring.
Oh yes, whether they'll come back. I agree that they're coming back, but I don't agree that those will need a lot more workers, because they're not labor-intensive activities that they're bringing back. It's because of automation that they're bringing them back. Anything labor-intensive will not be repatriated. And that's what I read, at least what managers are saying. So that doesn't concern me. I'm more concerned, in fact, about shortage of labor in the hospitality sectors and travel and all that, than shortage of labor because of the repatriated ones. And And ultimately, the reason for that shortage of labor is what was pointed out here. You know, why are we not paying them more? For the reasons I said, people are just hesitating to offer higher pay. Okay, next.
A word on labor and torture?
Well, actually, I think the French should have taken the word for labor from ancient Greek, where labor means the creation of something good, ergo. But you had a very long question. I'm not sure if it was a question or comment.
Some of it was about the transformation of the educational system, and is it still adapted to the labor force and the labor market we're going to be facing?
Yeah. It was mainly education. Well, the education curriculum has to be given by government. The government is not. It doesn't respond very quickly to the needs of society. So I'm in favor of a little bit more independence for schools, but I'm in two minds about it actually, because once you go into school, once you send your child to school, they're basically stuck there. You're not going to observe what they're learning and then move them out and back in. So it has to be a government job. You need good education departments, which don't always exist, unfortunately. And there was another question here actually that was interesting, the second one, before the lady. Where was it?
To include well-being in our models.
In our models or in our societies?
Well, in our economic models, I think that was part of the question.
Well, that we should improve well-being is my new campaign. Take partly influenced by my colleague Richard Laird, actually, who thinks that I'm not sure that's more of a philosophical question. He thinks that the objective of economists would be to devise theories that will how to make people happier. Only happiness matters. I'm not sure I agree that is the only objective of life, but it certainly should be a very big objective.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thanks, everyone. Please join me in a round of applause for Chris Pissarides. It's certainly been a privilege to have you sharing your views here with us. Thank you again.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, again, and thank you, Pierre.